Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Colorado history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1854, when the first whispers of gold began drawing desperate men into the Colorado Territory, a series of disappearances would mark the beginning of what local records would later describe as the most methodical elimination of human life ever documented in the Rocky Mountain region. The case centered around a remote claim in what is now known as Bramwell Gulch, approximately 14 miles northwest of the nascent settlement that would eventually become Golden City. The initial incident was reported on October 3, 1854, when a prospector named Tobias Fletcher failed to return to the makeshift camp he shared with 3 other men near Clear Creek. Fletcher had been tracking what he believed to be a rich vein of placer gold that extended up into the higher elevations of the foothills. According to the surviving testimony of his partner Jeremiah Walsh, Fletcher had spoken repeatedly of confronting what he termed that damned mountain hermit who had been claim jumping in the area. The hermit in question was a man known only as Silas Bramwell, described in contemporary accounts as standing well over 6 feet in height, with prematurely grey hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent decades exposed to mountain winds. Bramwell had arrived in the territory sometime in the spring of 1854, months before the major gold rush brought hundreds of prospectors into the region. Unlike the typical fortune seekers who worked in groups and established temporary camps, Bramwell had constructed what appeared to be a permanent homestead on a high plateau overlooking several promising creek beds. What made Bramwell's presence particularly unsettling to other prospectors was not merely his solitary nature, but his apparent indifference to the conventional rules that governed mining claims. He had staked no formal claim with the territorial authorities, posted no markers, and made no attempt to register his activities with the informal miners' associations that had begun to form in the area. Yet somehow, every promising site that prospectors attempted to work in his vicinity would prove barren within days of their arrival. The disappearance of Tobias Fletcher might have been dismissed as another casualty of the harsh mountain environment, where men regularly vanished due to exposure, accident, or simply the decision to move on to more promising territory. However, Fletcher's fate became a matter of serious concern when his mule returned to camp 3 days later, still carrying his prospecting tools and a leather pouch containing nearly 2 ounces of gold dust. The animal showed no signs of distress or injury, and its panniers remained properly secured, suggesting that Fletcher had not met his end in any kind of struggle or accident. Jeremiah Walsh, a former railroad worker from Pennsylvania with a reputation for level-headedness, convinced 2 other prospectors to accompany him in searching for Fletcher. The 3 men followed the mule's trail back into the mountains, eventually reaching an area where the terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate. At approximately 8,000 feet elevation, they discovered what appeared to be a recently used campsite, with the remains of a small fire and evidence that someone had spent at least 1 night there. More troubling was the discovery of Fletcher's distinctive leather hat, found hanging from a tree branch approximately 50 yards from the campsite. The hat showed no signs of damage, and its placement seemed deliberate rather than accidental. Walsh would later testify that the sight of the hat filled him with an inexplicable sense of dread, though he could not articulate why this simple object should inspire such a reaction. The 3 men continued their search for another 2 hours, calling Fletcher's name and examining every ravine and outcropping where a man might have fallen. Their efforts yielded nothing until they crested a ridge and caught sight of smoke rising from a chimney in the distance. The smoke originated from what appeared to be a substantial log cabin, constructed with a level of craftsmanship that seemed inconsistent with the temporary structures most prospectors erected. As they approached the cabin, Walsh noted that the surrounding area had been cleared with unusual thoroughness. Not only had trees been cut down, but their stumps had been removed and the ground leveled with such precision that it resembled formal landscaping rather than the rough clearing typical of frontier homesteads. More unsettling still was the complete absence of the debris and refuse that accumulated around most mountain dwellings. There were no discarded tools, no piles of cut wood, no evidence of the daily activities that sustained life in such isolation. The cabin itself was larger than it had appeared from a distance, consisting of what seemed to be at least 3 rooms with carefully chinked log walls and a roof of split shingles. A thin column of smoke rose from a stone chimney, indicating recent habitation. Yet despite their calls and the obvious signs of occupancy, no one emerged to greet them or acknowledge their presence. Walsh later described the silence around Bramwell's cabin as unnatural, noting that even the typical sounds of mountain wildlife seemed muffled or absent entirely. When they finally approached close enough to examine the cabin's single visible window, they discovered that it had been covered from the inside with what appeared to be heavy cloth or canvas, making it impossible to see into the structure. The 3 men spent nearly an hour in the vicinity of the cabin, calling for both Fletcher and Bramwell, but received no response, eventually growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. They decided to return to their camp and report Fletcher's disappearance to the territorial authorities. This decision would prove to be both prudent and prophetic, as none of them would ever see the cabin again under circumstances that allowed for careful observation. The formal report of Fletcher's disappearance was filed with the Jefferson Territory Provisional Government on October 7, 1854. The territorial marshal at the time was a former Texas Ranger named Samuel Morrison, who had considerable experience investigating unexplained deaths and disappearances on the frontier. Morrison's initial assessment was that Fletcher had most likely suffered an accident while working alone in dangerous terrain, but he agreed to conduct a preliminary investigation based on the unusual circumstances described by Walsh. Morrison's first action was to organize a larger search party consisting of himself, 2 deputized volunteers, and Jeremiah Walsh as a guide. The party departed from the Clear Creek camp on October 10th, intending to conduct a systematic search of the area where Fletcher had last been seen. However, when they reached the location where Walsh insisted they would find Bramwell's cabin, they discovered only an empty clearing, with no evidence that any structure had ever existed there. The clearing itself matched Walsh's description in terms of location and the unnatural levelness of the ground. However, there were no foundation stones, no debris from construction, and no indication that trees had been cut in the area within recent memory. More puzzling still was the complete absence of the stone chimney that Walsh had specifically noted, as such structures typically left permanent traces even after a building's destruction. When confronted with this apparent impossibility, Walsh became increasingly agitated, insisting that the cabin had been exactly where they now stood. He pointed out specific landmarks that he claimed to remember from his previous visit, including a distinctive rock formation and a dead pine tree that remained exactly as he had described them. Yet the cabin itself had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The search party spent 3 days in the area, expanding their search radius and looking for any trace of either Fletcher or Bramwell. They found no evidence of recent human habitation beyond the old campsite where Fletcher's hat had been discovered. Most significantly, they found no trace of the hat itself, though Walsh insisted it had been left undisturbed when they departed 4 days earlier. Marshal Morrison's official report, filed on October 14, 1854, noted the disappearance of Tobias Fletcher, but made no mention of Silas Bramwell or the mysterious cabin. The report concluded that Fletcher had most likely suffered a fatal accident while prospecting alone, and that his body had been carried away by wildlife or hidden by a rockslide. The case was classified as a probable accidental death, and no further investigation was authorized. In these personal records, Morrison described Walsh's account as either the fabrication of a disturbed mind or evidence of circumstances beyond conventional explanation. He noted particular concern about the methodical precision with which all traces of Bramwell's presence had been eliminated, writing that such thoroughness suggested either supernatural intervention or human planning of an unusually sophisticated nature. The disappearance of Tobias Fletcher marked the beginning of what contemporary records would eventually document as a pattern of vanishings that continued throughout the winter of 1854 and into the following spring. However, Morrison's private notes, discovered decades later in the territorial archives, revealed a more complex assessment of the situation. Over the course of 7 months, 6 more prospectors would disappear from the same general area, each case following a similar pattern of sudden absence, followed by the discovery of personal belongings in locations that seemed to make no logical sense. The second disappearance occurred on November 15th, when a prospector named Marcus Finley failed to return from a solo expedition into the upper reaches of Bramwell Gulch. Finley had been working a claim approximately 3 miles downstream from the area where Fletcher had vanished, and had no known connection to either Fletcher or the mysterious Silas Bramwell. Like Fletcher, Finley was an experienced mountaineer who had spent several seasons prospecting in California before coming to Colorado. Finley's disappearance was reported by his partner, a German immigrant named Klaus Weber, who had remained at their base camp due to an injured ankle. Weber told authorities that Finley had left camp at dawn, carrying his usual prospecting equipment plus provisions for 3 days. He had planned to follow a promising creek bed that led higher into the mountains, with instructions to return no later than November 18th. When Finley failed to appear by the appointed date, Weber organized a search party consisting of 4 other prospectors from nearby claims. The search revealed Finley's equipment scattered along the creek bed in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. His prospecting pan was found wedged between 2 rocks, approximately 2 miles from his intended destination, while his food supplies were discovered hanging from a tree branch nearly a mile in the opposite direction. Most disturbing was the discovery of Finley's journal, found open on a flat rock with its pages weighted down by carefully arranged stones. The journal's final entry, dated November 15th, described Finley's growing unease about being watched while he worked. The entry read, in part, "Something not right about this place. Keep hearing sounds like someone walking. But when I look around, nothing there. Found boot prints in the mud this morning that weren't mine. Too big to be mine. Following the creek up toward the high country tomorrow, but got a bad feeling about it." The journal's previous entries made no mention of unusual experiences or concerns about safety. Finley had consistently described his prospecting efforts in purely practical terms, noting promising locations and recording his daily progress. The sudden shift in tone in the final entry suggested that something had occurred during his last day at the camp that had significantly altered his perception of his circumstances. Klaus Weber noted that when Finley departed on November 15th, he had seemed cheerful and confident about his prospects. Weber recalled no indication that Finley felt threatened or concerned about his safety. This discrepancy between Finley's apparent state of mind when he left camp and the anxiety evident in his final journal entry would become a recurring element in subsequent disappearances. The third disappearance followed within 2 weeks, when brothers Nathan and Edgar Whitmore vanished simultaneously while working adjacent claims near the mouth of Bramwell Gulch. The Whitmore brothers were local men who had grown up in the Kansas Territory before moving west to pursue mining opportunities. Their familiarity with frontier conditions and their practice of working together made their disappearance particularly puzzling. The brothers had established their camp in a location that provided clear sight lines in all directions, making it nearly impossible for anyone to approach without being observed. They had also made arrangements with neighboring prospectors to check on each other daily, a common safety practice in areas where accidents could prove fatal before help arrived. When they failed to appear for a scheduled meeting on December 1st, their disappearance was discovered within hours rather than days. The Whitmore camp showed signs of normal activity up to the point of their disappearance. Their evening meal had been partially consumed but not cleared away, suggesting they had vanished sometime during or immediately after dinner on November 30th. Their tools remained properly stored, and their horses were still securely tethered. Most significantly, their weapons remained in the camp, including 2 rifles and a shotgun that the brothers reportedly never traveled without. The only unusual element found in the Whitmore camp was a series of marks carved into a tree at the camp's perimeter. The marks appeared to be fresh, cut into the bark with a sharp blade sometime within the previous 24 hours. The marks formed no recognizable pattern or symbol, consisting instead of seemingly random cuts of varying depth and length. However, their placement suggested deliberate intent rather than accidental damage. Local prospectors who examined the marks noted that they resembled the kind of blazes used to mark trails, but followed no conventional system of trail marking. Some suggested they might represent a warning or message, though no one could decipher their meaning. The marks would later prove significant when similar carvings were discovered at other disappearance sites. The 4th disappearance occurred under circumstances that finally convinced local authorities that they were dealing with something more than coincidental accidents. On December 19th, a prospector named Cole Harker vanished while traveling between 2 established camps, disappearing along a well-used trail that he had traversed safely dozens of times. Harker was considered one of the most capable and experienced men in the district. A former cavalry scout who had served in the Mexican War, he possessed survival skills that made him virtually immune to the typical hazards of mountain travel. His disappearance along a familiar route in clear weather conditions eliminated most conventional explanations for his fate. The trail where Harker vanished ran along a ridgeline that offered excellent visibility and few opportunities for concealment. Other travelers used the route regularly, and several people had seen Harker proceeding normally along the trail earlier in the day. His horse was found the following morning, still saddled and bridled, standing calmly at the edge of a meadow approximately 2 miles from where he had last been seen. Examination of the horse revealed no signs of distress or injury. Its tack remained properly adjusted, and Harker's belongings were still secured in the saddlebags. Most puzzling was the discovery that the horse's hooves were clean of mud or debris, despite the fact that the trail it had supposedly traveled was muddy from recent snowmelt. This suggested that the animal had been carefully cleaned, though the purpose of such an action remained unclear. The search for Harker involved more than 20 men and continued for 5 days. Every possible route he might have taken was thoroughly examined, and searchers paid particular attention to areas where he might have left the main trail for any reason. The search revealed no trace of Harker himself, but did uncover evidence that someone had been systematically observing the search efforts. Searchers found carefully concealed observation posts at several locations overlooking the areas being searched. These positions showed signs of recent occupation, with compressed earth indicating where someone had lain prone for extended periods. The posts were positioned to provide excellent views of the search activities while remaining invisible to the searchers themselves. The level of planning and preparation evident in these positions suggested that whoever had created them possessed considerable knowledge of both the terrain and the methods likely to be used in searching it. More disturbing was the discovery that some of the observation posts contained personal items belonging to the missing prospectors. A button from Fletcher's coat was found at one position, while another contained a brass buckle that Klaus Weber identified as belonging to Marcus Finley. These items had been placed carefully rather than dropped accidentally, suggesting they were intended to be found and to convey a specific message to those who discovered them. By January of 1855, the pattern of disappearances had created a climate of fear among the remaining prospectors in the Bramwell Gulch area. Many men abandoned their claims and relocated to areas closer to established settlements, while others began traveling in large groups for safety. The territorial government finally authorized a formal investigation, assigning a team of federal marshals to the case. The federal investigation was led by Marshal James Mackenzie, a former Pinkerton detective with experience in tracking fugitives across difficult terrain. Mackenzie's approach to the case differed significantly from previous efforts, focusing on establishing the precise timeline of events and identifying any connections between the missing men beyond their shared occupation as prospectors. Mackenzie's investigation revealed several previously unnoticed patterns in the disappearances. All of the missing men had made their camps or claims within a specific geographic area that formed a rough circle approximately 5 miles in diameter. More significantly, all had reported encountering or hearing about the mysterious Silas Bramwell in the weeks preceding their disappearances. The investigation also revealed that Bramwell himself had become increasingly active in the weeks following each disappearance. Prospectors working in areas adjacent to Bramwell Gulch reported seeing a tall figure moving through the forest at dawn or dusk, always at a distance that made positive identification impossible. These sightings followed a consistent pattern, with the figure appearing to conduct some kind of systematic survey of the terrain before vanishing back into the dense forest. Most troubling was the discovery that Bramwell had somehow acquired detailed knowledge of each missing prospector's habits, schedules, and planned activities. Evidence found at various locations suggested that he had been observing his eventual victims for extended periods before they disappeared. This surveillance appeared to be conducted with remarkable skill, as none of the missing men had reported feeling watched or threatened until their final journal entries. Mackenzie concluded that the disappearances were the result of deliberate human action rather than natural causes or accidents. His formal report, submitted to territorial authorities in February of 1855, recommended that Bramwell be considered a suspect in multiple homicides and that a substantial reward be offered for information leading to his capture. However, the investigation faced a significant obstacle in that no physical evidence of violence had been discovered at any of the disappearance sites. Without bodies or clear evidence of foul play, the case remained technically classified as multiple missing persons rather than homicides. This distinction limited the resources available for the investigation and prevented authorities from taking more aggressive action against Bramwell. The situation changed dramatically in March of 1855, when the first direct confrontation between Bramwell and those hunting him was finally documented. A group of 6 armed men, led by a former Texas Ranger named William Cassidy, had organized themselves into what they termed a citizen patrol, with the stated purpose of locating and apprehending Bramwell. Cassidy's group had spent 2 weeks systematically searching the mountains above Bramwell Gulch, using tracking techniques and coordination methods borrowed from military operations. On March 15th, they finally located what appeared to be Bramwell's current camp, situated in a natural rock shelter at approximately 9,000 feet elevation. The confrontation that followed was witnessed by only one survivor, a prospector named Daniel Morrison, who had been serving as a guide for Cassidy's group. Morrison's account, given to authorities 3 days later, described events that challenged conventional understanding of what one man could accomplish against 6 armed and experienced opponents. According to Morrison's testimony, the group approached Bramwell's shelter at dawn, intending to surround the position and force his surrender. The shelter was naturally defensible, consisting of a cave-like formation in the rock face with only one visible entrance. Cassidy deployed his men in a semicircle around the entrance while he called for Bramwell to emerge and surrender. The response came not from the shelter itself, but from positions behind and above the attacking group. Morrison described realizing that they were surrounded when rifle fire began coming from at least 3 different directions simultaneously. The accuracy and coordination of the shooting suggested multiple attackers, yet Morrison insisted that he saw only one figure moving between positions with a speed that seemed to defy natural limitations. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, but resulted in the deaths of 5 members of Cassidy's group. Morrison survived only because he had been positioned at the greatest distance from the shelter and was able to escape into dense forest when the shooting began. He spent 2 days hiding in the mountains before making his way back to the nearest settlement. Morrison's account included details that investigators found difficult to accept or explain. He described seeing Bramwell move from one shooting position to another across terrain that should have required several minutes to traverse, yet the timing of the shots suggested these movements were accomplished in seconds rather than minutes. He also reported that Bramwell appeared to anticipate exactly where each member of the attacking group would position himself, suggesting either supernatural prescience or an impossibly detailed knowledge of military tactics. Most disturbing was Morrison's description of the aftermath of the engagement. When the shooting ended, Bramwell emerged from concealment and methodically approached each of the fallen men. Rather than simply confirming their deaths, he appeared to be conducting some kind of examination or ritual over each body. Morrison observed this from a considerable distance and could not determine the exact nature of Bramwell's actions, but noted that they seemed deliberate and purposeful rather than random. The recovery of the bodies from Cassidy's group required a military expedition, as local authorities lacked both the manpower and equipment necessary to safely approach Bramwell's position. A detachment of cavalry from Fort Collins reached the site 4 days after the confrontation, finding the bodies arranged in a precise line with their weapons and equipment stacked nearby. The condition of the bodies provided the first physical evidence of Bramwell's methods and motivations. Each man had been killed by a single rifle shot placed with surgical precision, suggesting marksmanship skills of exceptional quality. However, post-mortem examination revealed that the men had also suffered additional injuries that appeared to have been inflicted after death. These post-mortem injuries followed a consistent pattern that suggested ritualistic rather than practical purposes. Each body bore identical marks carved into the forehead with a sharp blade, forming the same seemingly random pattern that had been found carved into trees at previous disappearance sites. The precise uniformity of these marks indicated that they had been made with considerable care and attention to detail. More disturbing was evidence that Bramwell had spent substantial time with the bodies after the engagement ended. The arrangement of the corpses and their equipment suggested careful positioning rather than the hurried concealment that might be expected after such a violent confrontation. This behavior indicated a level of confidence and control that seemed inconsistent with a man who had just fought against overwhelming odds. The military expedition also discovered Bramwell's shelter, which proved to be far more elaborate than Morrison's description had suggested. What appeared from the outside to be a simple cave had been extensively modified to create a multi-room dwelling with carved storage areas and a sophisticated ventilation system. The level of craftsmanship evident in these modifications suggested that Bramwell had been working on them for months or possibly years. The shelter contained evidence of Bramwell's activities that provided disturbing insights into his character and motivations. Personal belongings of all the missing prospectors were found carefully organized in what appeared to be a trophy collection. Each man's possessions were stored separately and labeled with carved wooden tags indicating the date of their disappearance. More troubling was the discovery of detailed journals kept by Bramwell, documenting his observations of each prospector's activities in the weeks before they disappeared. These journals revealed an obsessive level of surveillance, with entries describing daily routines, personal habits, and even conversations that Bramwell had somehow overheard from considerable distances. The journals also contained Bramwell's own account of the confrontations and disappearances, written in a precise, matter-of-fact style that showed no evidence of emotion or remorse. He described stalking and eliminating each prospector as a necessary task, comparable to controlling predatory animals that threatened his territory. The clinical detachment evident in these writings suggested a personality that lacked normal human empathy or moral constraints. Perhaps most disturbing were Bramwell's references to future plans, indicating that he considered his activities to be part of a larger, ongoing project rather than isolated incidents. He wrote extensively about the need to maintain the natural balance of the mountain environment and his role as its designated protector. These passages suggested a delusional belief system that justified his actions as serving some higher purpose. The discovery of Bramwell's journals and the evidence of his systematic approach to tracking and eliminating prospectors finally provided authorities with sufficient evidence to classify the disappearances as homicides. A federal warrant was issued for Bramwell's arrest, with authorization for lethal force if he resisted capture. However, the warrant would prove difficult to execute, as Bramwell had once again vanished completely by the time the military expedition reached his shelter. The search for Bramwell entered a new phase in the spring of 1855, with federal marshals and military personnel conducting systematic sweeps of the entire mountain region. These efforts were complicated by the vast area involved and the numerous natural hiding places available to someone with Bramwell's knowledge of the terrain. Despite involving more than 50 men and continuing for several weeks, the search produced no trace of Bramwell's current location. However, the intensive search did reveal evidence of Bramwell's extensive preparation for exactly this type of pursuit. Hidden caches of supplies and equipment were discovered throughout the mountain region, positioned to allow him to remain in the field indefinitely without returning to any permanent base. The sophistication of these preparations suggested that Bramwell had been planning for eventual discovery and pursuit long before his first confrontation with authorities. The caches contained not only basic survival supplies, but also detailed maps showing every trail, water source, and potential hiding place in the region. These maps included information that was not available in any official survey, indicating that Bramwell had conducted his own comprehensive reconnaissance of the area over an extended period. Some of the maps also contained notations about the movements and habits of various prospectors, suggesting that his surveillance activities had been far more extensive than previously realized. Most significantly, several of the caches contained evidence that Bramwell was not working alone. Supplies were found that exceeded what any one person could reasonably require, and some locations showed signs of use by multiple individuals. This discovery forced investigators to reconsider their assumption that they were dealing with a single, isolated individual rather than an organized group. The possibility that Bramwell was part of a larger organization raised disturbing questions about the scope and purpose of the activities in Bramwell Gulch. If multiple individuals were involved, the systematic nature of the surveillance and elimination of prospectors suggested a level of planning and coordination, that went far beyond simple territorial disputes or robbery attempts. Investigation into Bramwell's background provided few answers, but raised additional questions about his true identity and motivations. No official records could be found of anyone named Silas Bramwell arriving in Colorado Territory, nor could authorities locate any documentation of his previous residence or activities. This absence of records was unusual for the period, when most travelers carried some form of identification or letters of introduction. Inquiries sent to law enforcement agencies throughout the Western Territories produced no information about anyone matching Bramwell's description or methodology. This lack of record suggested either that Bramwell was using an assumed name, or that his activities in Colorado represented the beginning of his criminal career rather than a continuation of previous patterns. The investigation did reveal several unsolved disappearances in other mining regions that bore similarities to the Colorado incidents. Cases in California, Nevada, and Montana involved the vanishing of solitary prospectors under circumstances that included evidence of systematic surveillance and the discovery of personal belongings in unlikely locations. However, these incidents had occurred over a period of several years and showed no clear pattern of movement that would indicate the activities of a single individual or group. As summer approached, the frequency of disappearances in the Bramwell Gulch area began to decrease, though whether this represented a change in Bramwell's behavior or simply a lack of potential victims remained unclear. Most prospectors had abandoned the region entirely, while those who remained worked in large groups that would have been difficult for even multiple attackers to eliminate without substantial risk. The reduced activity did not indicate that Bramwell had left the area, as evidence of his continued presence appeared regularly throughout the summer months. Travelers reported seeing smoke from fires in remote locations, while hunting parties discovered campsites that showed signs of recent occupation, but were always abandoned by the time they could be thoroughly investigated. These sightings followed a pattern that suggested Bramwell was conducting deliberate psychological warfare against the remaining population, rather than simply avoiding detection. The timing and location of his appearances seemed calculated to maintain a constant sense of threat without providing opportunities for confrontation. This behavior indicated a sophisticated understanding of the psychological impact of sustained uncertainty and fear. The situation reached a climax in August of 1855, when a final confrontation occurred under circumstances that would permanently end Bramwell's activities in the region. A military patrol conducting routine reconnaissance discovered what appeared to be a permanent camp in a location that had been searched multiple times without finding any trace of human habitation. The camp was situated in a natural depression that made it invisible from any direction unless approached from a specific angle. The depression had been further camouflaged with carefully arranged vegetation that concealed the presence of several substantial structures. The sophistication of this concealment suggested that Bramwell had been developing this base of operations for an extended period, while maintaining the appearance that he was constantly moving from location to location. The structures within the camp included not only living quarters, but also workshops equipped with tools and materials for various purposes. Evidence found at the site indicated that Bramwell had been engaged in activities that went far beyond simple survival, including the manufacture of specialized equipment and the processing of materials taken from his victims. Most disturbing was the discovery of a workshop that appeared to be devoted to the creation of detailed scale models of the surrounding terrain. These models showed every trail, structure, and natural feature in the region with an accuracy that exceeded official military surveys. The models also included movable pieces representing individual prospectors, with notes indicating their daily routines and probable future movements. The level of detail in these models suggested an obsession with control and prediction that went far beyond practical necessity. Bramwell appeared to have been treating the entire mountain region as a complex game or experiment, with the prospectors serving as unwitting participants in his elaborate scheme of manipulation and elimination. The final confrontation occurred when the military patrol was detected approaching the camp. Unlike his previous pattern of avoiding direct engagement, Bramwell chose to make a stand in defense of his position. The resulting battle lasted several hours and involved not only Bramwell, but also at least 2 other individuals whose identities were never established. The engagement ended with the death of Bramwell and his associates, though not before they had inflicted substantial casualties on the attacking force. The tactical skill demonstrated by the defenders suggested military training of high quality, reinforcing earlier speculation that Bramwell's activities were part of a larger, organized effort rather than the actions of an isolated individual. Examination of the bodies after the engagement provided the first clear view of Bramwell himself, revealing a man who bore little resemblance to the descriptions provided by previous witnesses. Rather than the prematurely aged hermit described in earlier accounts, Bramwell appeared to be a man in his 30s with the physical conditioning of someone accustomed to sustained physical activity. His clothing and equipment were of higher quality than typically found among mountain prospectors, suggesting access to resources beyond what simple robbery of victims could provide. More significantly, documents found among Bramwell's possessions indicated connections to individuals and organizations outside Colorado Territory. These documents included correspondence that suggested Bramwell's activities were part of a larger effort to control access to mineral resources in the region. The true scope of this effort and the identity of those directing it remained unclear, as most of the correspondence used coded language and assumed names. The investigation into these broader connections was hampered by the reluctance of territorial and federal authorities to acknowledge the implications of what had been discovered. The possibility that an organized conspiracy was attempting to control mining activities through systematic elimination of independent prospectors raised questions about the security of the entire territorial development process. Official reports of the conclusion of the Bramwell case focused on the successful elimination of a dangerous individual and the restoration of safety to the mining region. However, private correspondence between investigating officials revealed ongoing concerns about the possibility that other individuals or groups might be conducting similar activities in different locations. The fate of the missing prospectors was never definitively determined. Despite extensive searches of the areas under Bramwell's control, no bodies were recovered beyond those of Cassidy's group. The careful organization evident in Bramwell's other activities suggested that the disposal of his victims' remains had been conducted with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized all of his operations. Some evidence suggested that the missing prospectors had been buried in locations that were subsequently disguised to prevent discovery. Searchers found several areas where the natural appearance of the terrain had been carefully restored after extensive disturbance. However, excavation of these areas proved impractical given the rocky nature of the mountain soil and the absence of clear indicators about specific burial locations. The personal belongings of the missing men that were recovered from Bramwell's camp were returned to their families where possible. However, many of the victims had no known relatives or had left no clear information about their backgrounds. These unclaimed possessions were eventually stored in territorial archives, where they remained as the only tangible evidence of lives that had ended in the remote mountains of Colorado. The Bramwell Gulch region was eventually resettled by new prospectors, though the area never regained the level of activity that had characterized it before the disappearances began. Many miners avoided the region entirely, while others approached it with a level of caution that reflected persistent unease about what had occurred there. Local folklore that developed around the incidents emphasized the importance of working in groups and maintaining constant vigilance against unknown threats. The case had broader implications for mining activities throughout the territorial period, leading to changes in the organization and supervision of prospecting operations. Authorities began requiring more detailed registration of mining claims and implemented systems for regular communication between isolated camps. These measures were designed to prevent the kind of systematic surveillance and elimination that Bramwell had been able to conduct over an extended period. However, questions about the true scope of the conspiracy suggested by Bramwell's documents were never fully resolved. Similar patterns of disappearances continued to occur sporadically in other mining regions, though none were investigated with the thoroughness that the Colorado incidents had received. The possibility remained that Bramwell's activities represented only one component of a larger, ongoing effort to control mineral extraction through intimidation and violence. The long-term impact of the Bramwell case extended beyond its immediate effect on mining activities in Colorado Territory. The systematic nature of the surveillance and elimination that had been documented provided a template for understanding similar incidents that occurred in other frontier regions. Law enforcement agencies began to recognize patterns of behavior that suggested organized rather than individual criminal activity. The case also demonstrated the vulnerability of isolated individuals to systematic predation in regions where law enforcement was limited or absent entirely. The months-long period during which Bramwell was able to operate without detection highlighted the need for better communication and coordination between frontier communities and territorial authorities. Perhaps most significantly, the discovery of Bramwell's detailed planning and preparation challenged assumptions about the spontaneous nature of frontier violence. The evidence suggested that some individuals and groups were approaching criminal activities with levels of organization and forethought that exceeded what law enforcement agencies were prepared to counter. The archives of the Jefferson Territory contain references to at least 12 other incidents that bore similarities to the Bramwell case, occurring in various locations between 1854 and 1859. Most of these incidents involved the disappearance of small groups of prospectors or travelers under circumstances that suggested systematic rather than random violence. However, none were investigated as thoroughly as the Colorado incidents, leaving questions about their true nature unresolved. Modern researchers examining territorial records have noted patterns that suggest coordinated activities across multiple regions during the height of the gold rush period. These patterns include similar methods of surveillance, comparable approaches to the elimination of witnesses, and evidence of supply networks that supported extended operations in remote areas. The scope of these activities remains a matter of speculation, but the evidence suggests that frontier violence was often more organized than contemporary authorities recognized. The Bramwell case stands as documentation of a period when the balance between individual opportunity and systematic control was decided through methods that left little room for official oversight or legal resolution. The men who ventured into Bramwell Gulch seeking fortune found instead a situation where their lives were valued only as obstacles to be removed or resources to be consumed. The silence that eventually settled over the region was not the peace of resolution, but the quiet of a place where questions had been answered through violence rather than investigation. The gold that drew prospectors to the mountains remained in the ground, while the men who sought it became part of a landscape that concealed more than it revealed. In the end, Silas Bramwell achieved a form of the control he had sought over the mountain environment, though not in the way he had intended. The fear generated by his activities created an exclusion zone more effective than any legal boundary, ensuring that the high country remained undisturbed by human activity for years after his death. Whether this outcome represented success or failure of his original purpose remained a question that died with him in the rocky shelter where his final stand had taken place. The official closure of the Bramwell case in September of 1855 marked the end of formal investigation, but not the end of questions about what had truly occurred in the mountains above Clear Creek. Marshal Mackenzie's final report acknowledged that significant aspects of the case remained unexplained, particularly regarding the identity and motivation of Bramwell's associates and the broader network that appeared to have supported their activities. The territorial government's decision to classify many documents related to the case reflected concerns about the potential impact of full disclosure on territorial development. Officials worried that detailed accounts of the systematic nature of Bramwell's operations might discourage settlement and investment in the region. Consequently, public records emphasized the successful elimination of a dangerous criminal while minimizing discussion of the organized nature of his activities. However, private correspondence between territorial officials revealed ongoing surveillance of other mining regions for similar patterns of activity. These efforts identified several locations where unexplained disappearances had occurred under circumstances that suggested the involvement of organized groups rather than individual criminals. The scope of these investigations and their results were never made public, leaving questions about the true extent of such activities unanswered. The impact on the families of the missing prospectors varied considerably depending on their circumstances and connections. Those who had maintained regular correspondence with relatives were eventually presumed dead, allowing for legal resolution of their affairs. However, many prospectors had left no clear record of their backgrounds or intentions, making it impossible to determine whether anyone mourned their disappearance. Klaus Weber, who had reported the disappearance of his partner Marcus Finley, eventually abandoned mining entirely and relocated to Denver, where he established a successful mercantile business. In later interviews, Weber described the experience of losing his partner as transformative, leading him to conclude that the pursuit of mineral wealth was not worth the risks involved. His decision to leave the mountains was shared by many other survivors of the period. Daniel Morrison, the sole survivor of Cassidy's confrontation with Bramwell, never fully recovered from his experience. Friends and family noted that he became increasingly withdrawn and paranoid, frequently expressing concerns about being watched or followed. Morrison left Colorado Territory in 1856 and was never heard from again. Some speculated that he had fallen victim to associates of Bramwell who remained active in the region. The physical evidence of Bramwell's activities gradually disappeared as natural processes reclaimed the sites where his operations had been conducted. The camouflaged camp was dismantled by military personnel, but within a few years, vegetation had grown over the area sufficiently to obscure any trace of human modification. The observation posts and hidden caches were similarly reclaimed by the natural environment. More significantly, the precise locations of many key sites became matters of dispute as the participants in various searches aged and their memories became less reliable. Jeremiah Walsh, who had first reported seeing Bramwell's cabin, later expressed uncertainty about the exact location where the structure had stood. This uncertainty was shared by other witnesses, making it impossible to conduct systematic re-examination of the areas involved. The confusion about locations was compounded by changes in the landscape caused by mining activities and natural processes. Flash floods in 1857 and 1858 significantly altered the topography of several creek beds, while extensive placer mining operations removed landmarks that had been used for navigation. By 1860, much of the area looked substantially different from its appearance during the period of Bramwell's activities. The question of whether justice had been served by Bramwell's death remained a subject of debate among those familiar with the case. While his elimination had ended the immediate threat to prospectors in the region, the failure to recover the bodies of his victims meant that many questions about their fate remained unanswered. Additionally, the evidence suggesting that Bramwell had been part of a larger organization raised concerns about whether his death had truly ended the threat he represented. Some investigators privately expressed the view that Bramwell's death had been too convenient, occurring at a moment when pressure for resolution of the case had become intense. The circumstances of the final confrontation, in which all of the defenders had been killed, eliminated the possibility of interrogation that might have revealed information about broader conspiracies. Whether this outcome was accidental or deliberately orchestrated remained a matter of speculation. The broader implications of the Bramwell case for understanding frontier violence were recognized by some contemporary observers, though these insights were not widely disseminated at the time. The systematic nature of Bramwell's operations demonstrated that criminal activities in remote areas could be far more sophisticated than authorities typically assumed. This recognition led to changes in law enforcement approaches, though these changes were implemented gradually and often without public acknowledgement of their origins. The territorial period saw several other incidents that bore similarities to the Bramwell case, suggesting that the patterns of organized violence he represented were not unique to Colorado. However, the documentation of these other cases was generally less thorough, making it difficult to determine whether they represented isolated incidents or components of broader patterns of criminal activity. The transition of Colorado from territorial to statehood status in 1876 brought changes in law enforcement and record-keeping that affected how historical incidents like the Bramwell case were preserved and interpreted. State authorities were generally less interested in territorial-era controversies, focusing instead on establishing new systems of governance and development. Consequently, many documents related to the case were archived without systematic organization, making later research more difficult. The discovery of additional documents related to the case occurred sporadically over the following decades, usually as a result of routine archival work rather than systematic investigation. These discoveries occasionally provided new insights into specific aspects of the case, but never enough to fundamentally alter understanding of what had occurred. The fragmentary nature of the surviving evidence ensured that key questions about Bramwell's background and motivations would remain unanswered. Local folklore that developed around the Bramwell case emphasized different aspects of the story depending on the audience and purpose of the telling. Mining communities focused on the importance of vigilance and cooperation in dangerous environments, while law enforcement agencies used the case as an example of the need for systematic investigation of unusual disappearances. Academic researchers who encountered the case in later decades were more interested in its implications for understanding frontier social dynamics. The physical sites associated with the case became destinations for occasional visitors, though the remote locations and difficult terrain limited such activities. Bramwell Gulch itself was eventually incorporated into a larger mining operation that obliterated most traces of the original landscape. The high country where Bramwell's final camp had been located remained largely undisturbed, but the absence of clear landmarks made it difficult for visitors to identify specific locations mentioned in historical accounts. The question of whether the case had been definitively resolved was complicated by reports of similar incidents that occurred in other regions during subsequent decades. While none of these later cases were directly connected to Bramwell or his known associates, the patterns of activity they represented suggested that the methods he had employed were not unique to his specific circumstances. This raised questions about whether his activities had inspired imitators, or whether he had been part of a larger tradition of organized frontier violence. The centennial of Colorado statehood in 1976 prompted renewed interest in territorial-era history, including re-examination of cases like Bramwell's that had received limited attention in official historical accounts. However, this re-examination was hampered by the loss of many original documents and the death of the last participants in the events. The passage of time had transformed what had once been a current investigative matter into a historical puzzle with limited prospects for resolution. Modern forensic techniques might have provided insights into aspects of the case that were beyond the capabilities of 19th-century investigators, but the absence of physical evidence made such analysis impossible. The failure to recover bodies or preserve crime scenes according to modern standards meant that key questions about Bramwell's methods and the fate of his victims would remain permanently unanswered. The Bramwell case ultimately stands as a reminder of the complexity that could underlie apparently simple incidents of frontier violence. What began as reports of missing prospectors revealed layers of systematic planning and execution that challenged contemporary understanding of criminal capabilities in remote areas. The investigation demonstrated both the potential for sophisticated criminal organization in seemingly primitive environments and the limitations of law enforcement systems designed for more conventional circumstances. The silence that eventually settled over Bramwell Gulch was not the natural quiet of an undisturbed mountain environment, but the imposed stillness of a place where human ambitions had been systematically eliminated. The gold that had originally attracted prospectors to the region remained largely untouched, protected not by legal restrictions or natural barriers, but by the memory of what had befallen those who sought it. Years later, when mining technology had advanced sufficiently to make large-scale extraction profitable, industrial operations would finally disturb the high country where Bramwell had conducted his activities. However, these operations focused on efficiency and profit rather than historical investigation, ensuring that any remaining evidence of his presence would be destroyed rather than preserved or examined. The transformation of the Colorado Territory into a modern state gradually obscured the circumstances that had made Bramwell's activities possible. Improved transportation and communication systems eliminated the isolation that had allowed him to operate without detection for extended periods. The establishment of regular law enforcement presence in remote areas made systematic predation far more difficult to conduct without discovery. Yet the fundamental questions raised by the Bramwell case remained relevant to understanding the relationship between individual opportunity and systematic control in environments where formal authority was limited or absent. The methods he employed for surveillance, intimidation, and elimination demonstrated possibilities for organized violence that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of territorial Colorado. The men who disappeared in Bramwell Gulch during the winter of 1854 and the spring of 1855 were seeking nothing more than the chance to improve their circumstances through hard work and determination. Instead, they encountered a system of control that valued their lives only as obstacles to be removed. Their fate served as a reminder that the pursuit of individual opportunity could lead to confrontation with forces far more organized and ruthless than they were prepared to recognize or resist. The story of Silas Bramwell and the prospectors who vanished in the Colorado mountains became part of a larger narrative about the costs of territorial expansion and resource extraction. While official accounts emphasized progress and opportunity, cases like this revealed the human price paid by those who ventured into contested spaces without understanding the nature of the competition they faced. In the end, the mountains kept their secrets as effectively as Bramwell had kept his. The high country above Clear Creek returned to its natural rhythms, unmarked by monuments or memorials to those who had struggled and died there. Only the archived documents and fading memories of a few survivors preserved any record of the systematic elimination that had occurred in the pursuit of control over a remote corner of the American frontier. The gold remained in the ground, and the silence remained unbroken.